All right, welcome everyone to the deep dive. Today we're going to be getting into something that's really impacting the energy sector. And when I say energy sector, I'm talking specifically oil and gas, those upstream and midstream companies. We're looking at how they're dealing with tariffs.
Yeah.
And global trade, all the volatility and everything that's been going on. It's a pretty big deal. So to kind of guide our deep dive today, we're going to be looking at information from EAG Inc.
Okay.
They're specialists in back office solutions, so they work specifically with energy companies. And then we've got some analysis on how tariffs are hitting the sector and how this whole outsourcing thing can actually be a pretty clever move.
Yeah. And really what we want to do is help you guys understand the pressure that these companies are under.
Right.
The financial pressure and then how they operate and all that. But then how outsourcing and specifically back office outsourcing can be a strategy, like a real, advantage for them to stay competitive, keep things running smoothly. We'll kind of break down some key points.
Give you some things to think about.
Exactly.
All right, so tariffs.
Yeah.
I mean, it sounds kind of technical, right?
Right.
But when you look at energy, it's like, whoa, okay, This is real. We're seeing these tariffs just like spiking.
Yeah.
And they're hitting, everything, like even the basics, the stuff you need to just build things, like steel, aluminum, the pipelines, that's all steel and aluminum.
Mm-hmm.
But then it also goes all the way to how energy products actually move around the world.
Yeah, and the costs are insane. Like the American Petroleum Institute, they said just steel tariffs alone can add $76 million to a pipeline project. Just think about that, $76 million. It's a huge, huge financial burden that comes straight from these policies.
Yeah, it's a lot. And it's not just like, oh, you got to pay more for the initial materials. It goes way beyond that.
Yeah.
You start looking at capital projects and the budgets, and all of a sudden they got to find 15, 25% more just to get the project done because of tariffs. And then you got to get the equipment right. But global supply chains, they're all messed up because of the new trade rules, so everything gets delayed.
Yeah, for sure. And then think about it. The direct cost goes up, that enough, but then it sets off this chain reaction. The regulations, they're always changing, trying to keep up with tariffs. Compliance gets expensive, just trying to understand what the rules even are. And then financial reporting, suddenly they got to track all this, predict what's going to happen. It's a whole new level of pressure.
Absolutely. And it's creating what our sources call a real cost crunch. Energy companies, they're getting squeezed from every direction.
Yeah.
So, given all this, what are we seeing? What are companies actually doing to push back against this pressure?
Well, one thing that's becoming a go-to strategy is back office outsourcing. It's about getting those really labor-intensive admin tasks off their plate and handing them to companies that specialize in it. And what's interesting is they can actually save a lot of money this way without having to compromise on how well those tasks actually get done.
Right. So you're essentially bringing in specialists, experts in certain parts of the business.
Yeah.
So let's talk about the benefits. specifically, what can energy companies really gain from outsourcing when they're dealing with all this tariff stuff?
So first off, cost reduction. Deloitte did research, and they found that outsourcing the back office can actually cut those admin costs by 20 to 40%. That's massive when you're already dealing with all these extra costs because of tariffs.
That is a lot, yeah.
Yeah.
And that's where companies like, you mentioned EAG services, right? They come in, and they're not just some general outsourcing company. They're focused specifically on energy.
Right, exactly. And that's what makes them so valuable. They really get the energy industry, the regulations, how things actually work on the ground. They can tailor solutions that a general provider just wouldn't even know where to start.
So it's about having that specialized knowledge.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then the other thing we talked about, keeping up with regulations.
Right.
Which are constantly changing, especially with tariffs.
Yeah.
How does outsourcing actually help with that?
So it's all about this idea of regulatory agility. James Patterson, he's an energy economist, and he says it's the most underrated benefit of outsourcing. Because when tariff rules change, and they can change really fast, you have these experts who are already on top of it. They're monitoring everything constantly. So you don't have to worry about constantly retraining your own people or scrambling to hire someone new every time something changes.
Right. So it's almost like having a dedicated team just focused on navigating all that complexity.
Yeah.
Now, the other thing that our sources mentioned is technology.
Oh, yeah.
It plays a big role in all this.
Absolutely. And this is where providers like EAG services, they have this advantage. They can bring in these advanced technologies that For a single energy company, it might be way too expensive to implement on their own. Things like automated systems for customs documents. So everything's digital, automated checks. It streamlines the whole thing. And then there's tools that can immediately tell you how a tariff change is going to hit your finances. Integrated financial planning platforms, even systems that can optimize your whole supply chain to kind of sidestep the worst of the tariffs.
So it's not just taking tasks off your plate. You're getting access to this whole other level of tech and expertise. Now, let's get specific. What are some of the back office functions that are really good candidates for outsourcing, especially with these tariff issues?
Well, first up, accounting and finance. I mean, those areas get hit hard when tariffs are all over the place. Outsourcing, not only does it save you money, but you're getting experts in things like transaction processing, so all your invoices, payments, that sort of thing. Companies can see 60% cost reductions per transaction by doing this.
Wow.
Because the outsourcing company, they're doing it at scale. And then there's financial reporting, which is crucial.
Right.
You got to make sure your reports are accurate, even with the tariffs impacting everything. And that includes the taxes, right? Tariff structures change, taxes change. It gets complicated. And then just keeping track of all the costs related to tariffs, making sure they're allocated properly. EAG services, they're known for having these really specialized accounting solutions just for energy, and they've built in all these tariff considerations.
So it's like they've already thought of everything.
Right.
Now, beyond the financial stuff, what about other operational areas within these energy companies?
So for upstream companies, those are the ones doing exploration and production. Land administration can be a huge burden. There's so much to manage: leases, title searches, making sure you're following regulations for land use, keeping records. It's a lot. And outsourcing this can really help cut down on overhead costs while still making sure those assets, which might be really sensitive to tariffs, are being managed properly.
So streamlining that whole land side of things.
Yeah.
And then you have production reporting and compliance. I mean, that sounds like it could become a real headache with tariffs thrown into the mix.
Oh, absolutely. Because the regulations are always evolving, trying to keep up with tariff changes, and then you got to do your production reporting, and it can be different depending on where you're operating. Outsourcing this has a bunch of benefits. You get consistent compliance, you cut down on labor costs for all that reporting, and you have access to experts who live and breathe this stuff. Plus, it can help integrate your production data with your financial data, so you get a much clearer picture for making decisions.
So we've talked about the why and the what of outsourcing, but let's focus on EAG Inc. for a bit.
Okay.
Since they're the specialists here.
Yeah, so they really highlight their experience, specifically in the oil and gas upstream and midstream. And their services are very focused. It's land, accounting, and production.
Right.
And that includes some really critical stuff like revenue processing, handling joint interest billing, when you have multiple companies partnering on a project,
Right.
Production data management, making sure all your regulatory reports are accurate. They do it all.
And it sounds like they're pretty flexible, too.
Yeah, totally. They can do the whole back office or just support a specific project or even just fill in if you're short-staffed. If there's a merger or an acquisition and things get crazy, they can scale up to handle it. Their whole goal is to free their clients up, let them focus on the big picture, innovation, growth, that sort of thing.
It sounds good in theory, but how does it actually work in the real world? And that's where those case studies are really interesting.
Yeah, they're a great way to see the real impact. So there's this midstream operator. They were facing this massive budget increase, almost $100 million, all because of steel tariffs.
Wow.
They were trying to expand their infrastructure, and the tariffs just threw everything off. So they went with EAG services, outsourced accounting, land administration, regulatory compliance, the whole shebang. And guess what? They cut their back office costs by 32%.
That's incredible, especially when you're talking about that kind of tariff hit.
Right. And they were able to cut 24 full-time positions, improve their compliance by 18%, and ended up freeing up like $4.2 million every year that they could put back into their core business. The CFO actually said that outsourcing basically offset a big chunk of the tariff costs so they could keep expanding without, killing their profits.
It's a good example of fighting back against those tariffs. Now, what about smaller producers? They're probably even more vulnerable.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a case study about a small producer who is really feeling the pressure because, they don't have the same resources as a big company.
Right.
They decided to use EAG's outsourcing solutions. And it made a huge difference. They cut their admin processing time by 45%, got their financial closing down from 15 days to just 6. They hit 100% compliance. And because they saved so much, they could actually stick to their drilling plans. Their operations director said they just didn't have the people or the knowledge in-house to handle all the regulations and financial stuff that came with the tariffs. Outsourcing gave them that expertise.
So it really can help level the playing field.
Yeah, definitely. And then there's this big global energy company. They had operations all over the world, so they were dealing with different tariffs everywhere.
Oh, wow.
They went with targeted outsourcing just for specific areas, and it really helped. They were able to standardize their financial reporting, even with all the different tariff structures. They cut their compliance personnel costs by 28%, and they got much better at forecasting how tariffs would impact them, so they could plan better.
So it seems like no matter what size company you are or how complicated your operations, outsourcing can make a real difference, especially with all these tariff challenges.
Exactly. But then the question becomes, how do you actually do it right? How do you make sure it works? And our sources had some good advice on that.
All right, so let's get into that. What are the key steps for a successful outsourcing transition?
So first of all, don't just jump into it blindly. You got to do a really thorough assessment of each function you're thinking about outsourcing.
Okay.
Don't just go for a one-size-fits-all approach. Really analyze each area, figure out if it's even a good fit for outsourcing, and where you're going to see the biggest benefits. EAG services, they actually offer these assessments to help companies figure this out. Then, once you've figured out what you want to outsource, don't try to do it all at once. A phased implementation is usually the smartest way to go.
Okay.
Start gradually, maybe pick a few key functions, and then roll it out slowly. That way you minimize disruptions, you can make adjustments as you go, and you build confidence internally before you go all in.
So kind of like a pilot program.
Yeah, exactly. And then you got to be able to measure whether it's actually working. So from the get-go, set clear goals, things you can measure. Like, how much are you cutting costs? Are you speeding up processing times? Are you improving compliance? Are you reducing errors? How are the technology systems performing? These are all things you can track.
Makes sense. And then the technology integration, we talked about that before, but it's super
Well,
important.
absolutely. Outsourcing relies on everything working together smoothly. Good providers like EAG services, they're experts at this. They have proven methods for integrating their systems with whatever the energy company already has. That way there are no nasty surprises, and you start seeing the benefits right away.
So thinking about the future, our sources gave a little glimpse into how all of this might change, how back office outsourcing in energy could evolve. What are some of the things on the horizon?
So it's pretty exciting to think about how technology is going to change things even more. We might see AI getting used to handle compliance. Imagine systems that can track regulatory changes and adjust your reporting automatically. And predictive analytics, that could be huge for forecasting how tariffs might change in the future so companies can plan ahead.
Right.
And then there's blockchain. That could bring a whole new level of transparency to supply chains, which is really important when you're tracking materials and costs related to tariffs. And then we might see virtual shared service centers where multiple companies can actually share the cost of outsourcing these really specialized functions.
So it sounds like this whole area is going to keep changing and getting even more sophisticated.
Definitely. And for energy companies trying to deal with all this tariff uncertainty and the craziness of global trade, it's going to be crucial to stay on top of these trends and really think strategically about how to use outsourcing. If they want to succeed in the long run, they got to be adaptable.
So to sum it all up, it's clear that in today's world, with tariffs going up and trade policies all over the place, back office outsourcing is not just some way to cut a few costs here and there. It's a real strategic tool that can help energy companies adapt, stay competitive, and build a more resilient foundation for their operations.
Absolutely. If energy companies really understand these outsourcing strategies and how powerful they can be, it's going to give them a huge advantage as they navigate all the complexity of the modern energy market.
And on that note, here's something to think about. As global trade keeps evolving and outsourcing technology gets even more advanced, what kind of new and innovative ways might we see companies use these tools? Not just to deal with challenges, but to actually create new opportunities. It's something to keep an eye on for sure. All right. Well, thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
Thanks, everyone.